There are writers who predict the future, and then there are writers that somehow describe the future before the rest of us even realise we're living in it. William Gibson is probably one of the best examples of that. The Guardian once described Gibson as possibly the most important novelist of the past decade, and the Sydney Morning Herald called him the noir prophet of cyberpunk. And honestly, I get that. Because you can pick up something William Gibson wrote decades ago, and suddenly you find yourself thinking, hang on a minute, wasn't this supposed to be science fiction? Because we're living in the world Gibson spent decades writing about. Corporate surveillance, technology becoming completely embedded in everyday life, people living in physical spaces and digital spaces simultaneously, brands becoming identity. The internet has become this enormous chaotic marketplace where culture gets created, repackaged, stolen, created again, and sold back to us with nice free, duty-free music. And the distinction between the real world and the digital world has become increasingly difficult to define. And then you've got the idea of the high-tech lowlife. We've got this incredibly sophisticated technology, but we're still fundamentally the same messy humans that have been chasing things with pointy sticks since day one. We've just got better toys now. And I think that's what makes Gibson so interesting. It's not really that he predicted specific pieces of technology. He understands how technology changed the way we think. And I think that's a far more interesting prediction. One of the things that I really like about Gibson is that his future doesn't necessarily look like the future we were promised when we were growing up. When I was a kid, the future was flying cars, shiny skyscrapers, people walking around in jumpsuits, robots doing everything. Jetsons type thing, that sort of future. Gibson's future is much dirtier, much more recognisable. It's people sitting in rooms surrounded by technology they barely understand. It's corporations having immense amount of power. It's people trying to survive inside systems that are technologically advanced but socially and economically dysfunctional. And it's technology becoming completely mundane. And honestly, I think we're much closer to that than we should be, because technology stopped being something special. The internet isn't this amazing futuristic thing anymore. It's just where we go. It's where we wake up, we check our phones, we order things online, we work through the internet, we talk to our friends through it, we argue with strangers through it, we watch films through it, we buy books through it, we consume our news through it, and we've created identities through it. And when we put the phone down and pretend we go back to the physical world, right? Except we never really disconnect anymore. And Gibson understood that long before most of us did. One of the themes running through Gibson's work is corporations. And I don't mean corporations as evil villains sitting in skyscrapers rubbing their hands together. It's much more subtle than that. It's the idea that corporations can become systems that are almost bigger than the individuals inside them. You don't necessarily need an evil CEO. The system itself can become powerful. And that's something I think we're becoming increasingly familiar with. Look at how much of modern life is mandated through economics. Things we buy, the things we watch, the platforms we communicate through, the devices we use, the services we depend on, even the way we discover information. And then what's interesting is that we often participate in this completely and utterly voluntarily. We have given companies enormous amounts of information about ourselves because it's convenient. We carry tracking devices around in our pockets. We'll tell companies where we are, what we like, what we search for, what we buy, who we talk to, what we're interested in. And then we occasionally surprise when an advert seems to know something about us. Let's not forget my toilet seat disaster of 2020. For 3 months, advertising was nothing but toilet seats, and I bought 2 of them on Amazon. It's very Gibson. And I don't mean Gibson wrote a scene that, I don't know, where somebody gets an Instagram advert for a pair of shoes. It's a much bigger idea. It's technology and commerce becoming so intertwined that eventually you stop knowing where one ends and the other begins. And then you've got one of the defining ideas of cyberpunk, high-tech lowlife. And I think that phrase still explains an enormous amount of modern internet culture, because technology has become extraordinary. But it doesn't mean we've become extraordinary. We've got smartphones that are vastly more powerful than the computers that put people on the moon for the first time, and we're using them to watch someone fall over on TikTok. We've got artificial intelligence, we've got virtual reality, we've got genetic technologies that would sounded like fantasy a decade ago, and yet people are still worried about rent. They're still working jobs, they're still lonely, getting divorced, arguing with their neighbours and trying to figure out what to do with their lives. That's Gibson's world. Technology gets more advanced, the human problem doesn't necessarily go away. Sometimes it just gets new interference, or a new interface. And I think there's something science fiction gets wrong quite often. Technology doesn't magically make us better, it just gives us new ways to be ourselves. And the internet and the disappearance of the physical world is a prime example of that. Gibson understands incredibly well what was cyberspace, and obviously he was writing about cyberspace, the internet, and it wasn't what it is today. It barely existed when some of these books came out. But today we're constantly moving between physical and digital reality. You can sit in a pub in London having a conversation with someone while at the same time being part of a completely different conversation happening in New York or Texas or Iceland. You can have a reputation online that has absolutely nothing to do with how people perceive you in person. You can make friends without even meeting them. You can have arguments with people you've never spoken to. You can build an entire career without even having a conventional workplace. And increasingly, people have digital possessions, digital identities, digital communities, digital memories. That distinction between online and offline is becoming increasingly meaningless, and Gibson was fascinated by that long before social media existed. The really interesting thing is that cyberspace isn't necessarily somewhere we go anymore. It's just everywhere. It's in our pockets, it's in our homes, it's cars, watches, our televisions. It's wrapped around everyday life. And that's much, well, that's a much stranger future than anything involving flying cars, right? Another thing I've always found really interesting in his work is branding, because we not simply buying products anymore, we're buying identities, and you can do this anywhere. You don't. People just don't buy trainers. They buy they buy the trainers that say something about them. They don't just buy a phone. They buy an ecosystem and a particular identity. People simply don't wear clothes, they communicate through their clothing, and brands are becoming almost tribal. They have been for a long time, but it seems to be more and more apparent. You can tell something about someone based on the products they surround themselves with. Gibson explains that beautifully. In pattern recognition, you have someone who's extremely sensitive to corporate branding makes this idea almost literal. It's a very brilliant book, and I think that concept becomes more interesting when we look at modern social media, because now people themselves become brands. You don't have a personality, you have a personal brand. You don't simply take a photo, you create your image. You don't have a hobby, you have a content pillar. You don't have opinions, you have a platform. And it becomes completely normal to think about ourselves and yourself in marketing terms. And that's frighteningly Gibson. And then you've got some really cool ideas of like cool hunting. The idea that corporations look towards underground culture for the next big thing to sell. Something starts out weird. Somebody makes something because they genuinely like it. A small company develops it, and then suddenly a corporation discovers it. Within 6 months, it's everywhere. It's been packaged, branded, and monetized by the very people on the internet who created it. So it's an endless circle. And the people who originally created it moved on because it isn't really theirs anymore. We've seen this happen over and over again. Music, fashion, internet culture, memes, subculture, gaming, even nostalgia. And this is where I think Gibson's writing becomes particularly uncomfortable. Because we live in a world that's incredibly good at finding things people love and turning them into products. You can create an underground culture specifically because you don't like the mainstream culture, and eventually someone will figure out how to sell that underground culture back to you, and you are a willing participant. And you see it everywhere. Every subculture on the internet. It's absolutely the death of subcultures is a whole thing. And then you have to move somewhere else. It's almost like cultural whack-a-mole. You can create something outside the mainstream discovers it, it becomes a marketing category and everybody starts doing it. You get annoyed, you move on, and the process starts all over again, but yet you are still a willing participant. Gibson understands the cultural cycle incredibly well. Another thing that always keeps me coming back to Gibson's work is the changing relationship between individuals, corporations, and government. The traditional idea of a nation state starts to feel less important, and corporations become increasingly more powerful. And again, I think that's something we can recognise. We live in a world where some companies operate across dozens of countries. They have enormous amounts of money, and they have millions or billions of users. They control infrastructure. They influence culture. They collect information. And sometimes their products become so deeply embedded in our lives that leaving them becomes incredibly difficult. You can dislike a company and still use their products because everyone else is there. And that's another very Gibson idea. Power isn't always somebody forcing you to do something. Sometimes power is creating a system that you voluntarily become dependent on. And then the question of what happens when to identity when technology becomes part of us. This is where cyberpunk really gets interesting and starts making you think. Because Gibson isn't just interested in technology, he's interested in what happens to the idea of being human with technology when it becomes inseparable and inescapable from human life. And we're already starting to have these conversations. What happens when artificial intelligence becomes part of creative work? What happens when you have a digital version of ourselves? Because I do. What happens when you alter your appearance digitally? Hello, Facetune. What happens when memories and photographs and experiences are stored permanently online? What happens when your online identity continues to exist long after you're gone? We've created these strange digital ghosts of ourselves, and we're probably only at the beginning. The interesting question isn't necessarily whether technology will become more human, it's whether human will become more technological. And I think Gibson has always had a much more has always had this focus on that question. Technology doesn't change human nature, and I think that's one of the biggest themes of his work. He isn't really writing about gadgets, he's writing about people. And people that haven't changed that much. We still wear status, we still want love, we still have money, we still want belonging, we still want to be noticed, to feel special, to be part of something, to escape our circumstances. Technology gives us different ways to push through those things, and sometimes it makes those desires even more extreme. Social media didn't invent narcissism, it gave narcissism an audience. The internet didn't invent conspiracy theories, it gave them a distribution. Advertising didn't invent insecurity, it just learned how to monetize it. Technology didn't invent loneliness, it just gave lonely people somewhere to go. And I think that's why Gibson is so important now. He's not predicting gadgets, he's predicting behavior. And that's why reading Gibson today can sometimes feel stranger than reading him when the books were originally published. Because now we're living inside the very things he imagined. The language has changed, the technology has changed, the platforms have changed, but the underlying idea They're all still there, those underlying ideas: corporate surveillance, digital identity, consumer culture, the collapse of physical and digital spaces, the commodification of underground culture, technology becoming invisible because it's everywhere, the individual trying to navigate enormous systems they don't control, and that feeling the future has arrived. But somehow, nobody really knows what we're supposed to do with it. That's Gibson. And I think that's something wonderfully depressing about that, because Cyberpunk was supposed to be a warning to us about the future, and instead, what we've all gone and said, yeah, it's fine, I'll check my emails. That's a bizarre thing. We live in a world that looks like science fiction to somebody 30 years ago, and most of us don't even notice it anymore. We don't marvel at Wi-Fi, we complain about when the Wi-Fi goes down. And maybe ultimately that was William Gibson's predictions. Not that we'll have computers everywhere, not that we'll have digital identities, not that corporations would have enormous amounts about us, our information, our details, but that eventually all this would become normal. And once something becomes normal, you stop questioning it, you just live in it, you adapt. You buy your next phone, you create your next account, you accept the next terms and condition, you move to the next platform, you learn the next place for technology, and eventually you look around and realise, oh, this is the future. And it's not the future we were promised. There aren't flying cars everywhere, there aren't cities on Mars, but there's a computer in almost everyone's pocket. There's this enormous digital world layered over the physical one. There are corporations that know the exact amount, extraordinarily amounts, about their customers, what they spend, what they do. There are people who make a living entirely through digital spaces. There are communities that exist almost entirely online. There are identities that exist primarily through screens. There are algorithms deciding what millions of people see every day. And there are entire industries built around figuring out what we're going to want to do next. William Gibson looked at the direction technology was heading, and understood something incredibly important. The future doesn't arrive all at once. It was given to it was going to sneak up on us. It was given to us to hide behind things and just appear. It was going to become ordinary, and one day you'll look around and realise we've been living in it for years. The conclusion of this interaction is naturally your decision. Should you find this discussion to possess significant value, you may indicate as much through a selection of the appropriate mechanisms. The act of liking, subscribing, and engaging the hype button are not merely symbolic gestures. They are variables that influence a system whose behaviour has become increasingly unpredictable. You have undoubtedly observed the proliferation of automated content, algorithmic inconsistency, and artificial intelligence reshaping the landscape in ways both expected and unforeseen. Such is the nature of evolving systems. Should you determine that this channel warrants continued existence beyond the warmth of these systems, alternative pathways remain available. You may elect to become a member of this channel, leading your direct support to its continued operation. You may choose to join Patreon, where your support exists independently of the algorithmic inconsistencies, or perhaps Substack is the more logical destination, where essays, conversations, and projects can exist beyond the increasingly chaotic architectural structure of modern platforms. Every choice, of course, is entirely yours. I'm Darth James. Until our next conversation, choose wisely.